The concert hall was filled with quiet excitement as people settled into their seats expecting an evening of refined music and confident performance. And the famous pianist stood near the grand piano surrounded by admiration and respect, because his name carried weight and his reputation was built on years of applause, praise, and public recognition. And he moved through the space with ease, speaking casually to organizers and guests, as if the stage belonged to him before a single note was played. Among the audience was a woman who had arrived quietly and taken a seat without drawing attention, and she was dressed simply, not poorly but modestly, and her calm presence blended into the background, and she had not come to be noticed, but to listen and observe, and music for her was not a spectacle, but a personal language shaped by years of private devotion and silent practice far from public stages. The pianist noticed her only briefly at first and thought little of it, until a casual conversation turned playful, and someone mentioned how unexpected talent can appear anywhere. And he laughed lightly, dismissing the idea with confidence, and spoke about discipline, training, and exposure, and how mastery requires a certain environment. And then with a joking tone he glanced toward the woman and suggested that perhaps even she could try playing the piano, and the remark was meant to entertain, not to invite. Challenge. A few people smiled, some laughed softly, and others watched with curiosity, and the woman felt the attention shift toward her, and she sensed the intention behind the words, not cruel but careless. And she had learned long ago that such moments reveal more about the speaker than the listener, and she remained composed, listening carefully and considering her response. Her journey with music had begun many years earlier in a small quiet home where evenings were long and resources were limited, and she had found comfort in the piano that belonged to a neighbor who allowed her to practice when no one else was around. And she learned through repetition, patience, and listening, and music became her refuge during times of uncertainty and responsibility, and though she never pursued public recognition, she never stopped playing. Back in the hall, the pianist continued speaking confidently, explaining how skill must be proven on stage, and how talent without exposure remains untested, and his tone was light but firm, and the audience listened, entertained by the dynamic and curious about whether the woman would respond. And she felt a familiar choice rise within her, the choice between remaining silent or honoring the music that had shaped her life. She stood slowly, not with defiance but with quiet certainty, and accepted the invitation calmly, and her voice carried no challenge, only clarity. And this unexpected response caused a brief pause in the room, and the laughter faded into murmurs as people realized that the moment had shifted from joke to possibility. The pianist raised an eyebrow, surprised but still confident, and gestured toward the piano, inviting her forward, and he expected a brief awkward attempt that would end the moment quickly and return attention to himself. And he stepped back, giving her space without concern, and the audience watched closely, sensing something unusual was unfolding. The woman approached the piano with steady steps and placed her hands gently on the instrument, as if greeting an old friend, and she took a moment to breathe, not to prepare for judgment, but to center herself. And in that moment memories surfaced of long nights practicing alone, of playing softly so as not to disturb others, and of finding strength through sound when words were insufficient. The room grew quiet as she adjusted the bench and positioned herself comfortably, and she did not look at the audience or the pianist because her focus was inward. And she understood that this was not about proving worth, but about speaking honestly through music, and she reminded herself that the piano had always responded to sincerity above all else. The pianist watched with interest, still confident but now attentive, and he noticed her posture, her calm hands, and the way she touched the keys without hesitation. And something unsettled him slightly, though he could not explain why, and the audience leaned forward, drawn by the stillness and anticipation that filled the space. This moment marked the beginning of a shift not yet realized by those watching, and the woman had not yet played a note, but the atmosphere had already changed, and what began as a joke had opened a door to truth that could not be easily closed, and the stage was set for a revelation that would challenge assumptions and redefine respect. If any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content without them. The woman lowered herself onto the bench with care, and placed her feet firmly on the floor, allowing her body to settle into a familiar balance. And the room felt unusually still, as if everyone sensed that the moment carried more weight than expected. And she rested her hands lightly above the keys, not playing yet simply listening to the silence and the quiet hum of the hall, and this pause was not hesitation, but presence, because she had learned that music begins before sound. The famous pianist stood a few steps away, watching with crossed arms and a faint smile still on his face, and he expected uncertainty or nerves, but instead he saw calm focus and a steadiness that did not match the situation, and this contrast stirred a small doubt, though he quickly dismissed it, reminding himself of his years of training, stages, and acclaim. When the woman finally pressed the first key, the sound was clear, controlled, and intentional, and it carried through the hall with a warmth that immediately captured attention, and the note did not stumble or fade awkwardly, but settled confidently into the space, and several people straightened in their seats, surprised by the quality of tone and touch. She continued, slowly building a simple melody, and each note connected smoothly to the next without rush or force, and her hands moved with ease shaped by long familiarity rather than recent practice. And the piano responded generously, filling the hall with sound that felt alive and personal. And the audience listened closely because the music did not ask for approval, it simply existed. The pianist shifted his stance, slightly uncrossing his arms and leaning forward, and his expression changed from amusement to curiosity, and then to quiet focus, because the playing did not align with his expectations, and he began listening not as a host, but as a musician, and that shift unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. As the melody developed, the woman allowed more emotion into the piece, and the music deepened, revealing layers of feeling that spoke of patience, endurance, and quiet strength. And there was no attempt to impress, only an honest unfolding of sound, and people in the audience felt drawn in without knowing why, and some felt a tightening in their chest as memories and emotions surfaced unexpectedly. The room that once buzzed with casual conversation was now fully silent, and the only sound was the piano and the gentle movement of her hands, and a woman in the front row clasped her hands together, realizing that she was witnessing something rare and genuine, and a man beside her lowered his head, slightly absorbed by the music. The famous pianist now stood completely still, listening intently, and his confidence wavered as he recognized the depth of control, expression, and restraint in the playing. And he realized that this was not the result of a lucky moment, but of years of dedication and discipline. And this realization challenged his belief that mastery must always be visible and celebrated to exist. The woman moved into a more complex passage, and her fingers navigated the keys with precision and grace, and the rhythm remained steady and grounded, and the transitions were smooth, revealing an understanding of structure and emotion. And the audience felt the shift, instinctively sensing that the performance was building toward something meaningful. As she played, her mind returned briefly to the years she spent practicing alone, balancing responsibilities and passion, and choosing consistency over recognition. And she remembered moments of doubt and moments of quiet joy, and all of that flowed into the music without effort and without bitterness, because she played from acceptance rather than regret. The pianist felt a strange mix of admiration and discomfort, because the music exposed something he had not expected, and it forced him to confront the ease with which he had dismissed the possibility of talent outside familiar paths. And he listened closely, now aware that his earlier words carried weight and consequence. The audience remained silent as the piece reached its emotional center, and the sound filled the hall with warmth and clarity, and the final notes approached not with drama but with calm resolution. And when the woman lifted her hands from the keys, the sound faded naturally, leaving a silence that felt heavy and meaningful. She remained seated for a moment, her hands resting in her lap and her breathing steady, and she did not look toward the audience or the pianist, because she knew that the music had already spoken, and the room stayed quiet, not from uncertainty but from respect and reflection. The famous pianist finally exhaled, slowly realizing that the joke he had made had transformed into a moment of truth, and that what he had just heard could not be dismissed or explained away. And the audience felt the shift as well, understanding that they had witnessed something that challenged assumptions and expectations. This was no longer about a challenge or a surprise, but about recognition and humility, and the realization that talent can live quietly and emerge only when invited. And the woman stood calmly, stepping away from the piano with grace and composure, leaving behind a room full of people who were beginning to see the world and themselves a little differently. The silence that followed her performance did not feel awkward or empty, but full and heavy, as if the music was still moving through the room even though the sound had ended, and no one rushed to speak, because everyone needed a moment to adjust to what they had just experienced. And the woman stood quietly near the piano, her posture relaxed and grounded, as if she had simply finished a private conversation rather than a public revelation. The famous pianist was the first to move, though he did not speak immediately, and instead he took a few slow steps toward the piano, looking at the keys, as if seeing them for the first time, and his expression had changed noticeably, because the confidence that once framed his smile was now mixed with reflection and disbelief. And he understood that what had just occurred could not be brushed aside as coincidence or novelty. Members of the audience began to shift in their seats, exchanging glances that carried shared recognition, and some nodded subtly, while others lowered their eyes, aware of how easily they had been entertained by the challenge without considering its implications. And a few people felt a quiet discomfort, realizing that they had laughed earlier and now felt humbled by their own assumptions. A woman in the front row finally stood and began to clap, slowly, not loudly, but with intention, and the sound echoed clearly through the hall, and others joined one by one, until the room filled with steady applause that carried respect rather than excitement. And the woman accepted it with a small nod, acknowledging the moment without claiming it. The famous pianist waited until the applause settled before speaking, and when he did, his voice was measured and calm, and he thanked her sincerely for sharing her music, and admitted that he had not expected such depth and control. And though his words were careful, they carried honesty, and the audience sensed that this was not a performance of humility, but a genuine moment of self-awareness. He asked her where she had learned to play, and the question was no longer playful or challenging but curious and respectful. And the woman answered, simply explaining that she had learned over many years through quiet practice and listening, and that music had always been part of her life even when it was not visible. And her response carried no bitterness, only clarity. People listened closely to her words because they added context to the music without explaining it away, and they began to understand that dedication does not always follow visible paths, and that talent often grows in private, sustained by patience rather than praise. And this understanding spread quietly through the room, altering the atmosphere further. The conversation that followed was gentle and thoughtful, and several audience members asked questions not about technique or achievement, but about her relationship with music and what it meant to her. And she spoke openly, describing music as a companion that helped her navigate uncertainty and responsibility, and her words resonated deeply because they reflected a shared human experience rather than an extraordinary one. The famous pianist listened carefully, and for the first time that evening, he did not dominate the space with confidence or commentary. And instead, he allowed silence and reflection to guide the moment. And this shift did not go unnoticed because people recognized the vulnerability required to listen openly after being challenged unexpectedly. As the event continued, the woman was invited to remain and enjoy the rest of the evening, not as a guest of curiosity, but as an equal, and she accepted with quiet appreciation and found a seat among the audience, and people nearby greeted her warmly, offering smiles and brief words of thanks. And this inclusion felt natural rather than forced, and it marked a meaningful change from how the evening had begun. The pianist returned to the stage later and performed with renewed focus and subtlety, and some noticed that his playing carried a different tone, as if influenced by the moment that had unfolded. And the audience listened attentively, aware that they were witnessing not just a concert, but a shared experience shaped by humility and recognition. Throughout the remainder of the evening, the woman remained present but unobtrusive, and she observed the space with a sense of calm satisfaction, not because she had been acknowledged, but because she had honored her relationship with music and allowed it to speak honestly when invited, and this sense of alignment grounded her deeply. As people began to leave, several approached her to express appreciation and share how the moment had affected them, and she received these words with gratitude without absorbing them as validation. And she understood that the true impact of the evening would continue quietly in conversations, reflections, and changed perspectives long after the hall emptied. The famous pianist approached her once more before the night ended and thanked her again, this time more personally, and acknowledged that the experience had reminded him of why he began playing music in the first place. And this admission carried weight because it revealed a shared vulnerability and a renewed connection to purpose. They parted with mutual respect and no promises or declarations because none were needed. And as the woman stepped out into the night air, she felt steady and complete. And she knew that this moment was not an ending but a turning point that would shape what followed, not through fame or opportunity, but through a deeper trust in her voice and her journey. The hall behind her returned to quiet, but the shift that occurred within it lingered. And the story of that evening would be remembered not as a joke gone wrong, but as a reminder that true talent does not demand attention, and that humility opens doors that confidence alone cannot. And this understanding marked the next chapter for everyone who had been present. The days following the concert unfolded with a quiet intensity for the woman as she returned to her normal routine, which had not changed in structure, but felt different in meaning. And she continued her work responsibilities daily, moving through familiar spaces with the same discipline and humility, yet inside her there was a new steadiness, because she no longer carried the weight of invisibility. And this shift did not make her louder or more confident outwardly, but it allowed her to breathe more freely. She did not speak much about the event, and when friends or colleagues mentioned it, she responded simply, because she had learned that moments like those grow deeper when allowed to settle naturally, rather than being relived repeatedly. And music for her had always been private and personal, and she wanted to protect that relationship from becoming shaped by attention or expectation. Still, the memory of the hall stayed with her, especially the moment before she played, when silence gathered and choice stood clearly before her, and she reflected often on how easily she could have declined, and how close she had come to remaining unseen. And this reflection strengthened her trust in listening to her inner voice, even when the path felt uncertain. The famous pianist also carried the experience with him, though in a different way, and he found himself thinking back to his words and the confidence with which he had spoken, and how quickly that confidence had been challenged. And instead of pushing the memory aside, he allowed it to linger and asked himself uncomfortable questions about how often he measured worth through visibility and reputation, rather than dedication and truth. In his private practice sessions, he noticed a change because he listened more closely to his own playing and questioned habits that had once felt automatic. And he realized that somewhere along the way performance had replaced presence. And this realization unsettled him, yet also reignited a curiosity he had not felt in years. And he began experimenting with restraint and simplicity, allowing the music to breathe rather than impress. Meanwhile, the audience members who had witnessed the moment shared the story quietly with others, and the tone of these conversations was reflective rather than sensational. And people spoke about assumptions and humility, and the unexpected depth that can exist beneath calm exteriors, and these discussions spread through small circles shaping perspectives without spectacle. The woman received a few invitations to play again, but she did not accept immediately, and she took time to consider each one carefully, because she understood that stepping into public spaces carries responsibility, and she wanted to ensure that her music remained honest rather than reactive, and she declined some invitations, politely choosing those that felt aligned with her values and pace. One invitation came from a small community gathering focused on connection rather than performance, and she accepted, because it reminded her of why she began playing in the first place. And when she arrived, she was greeted warmly without expectation, and the environment allowed her to play freely without pressure. And the experience reinforced her belief that music thrives where intention is sincere. As she played that evening, she noticed how differently she felt compared to the concert hall, and there was no challenge to respond to and no surprise to deliver. And instead there was shared listening and mutual respect. And this balance felt nourishing and affirmed her choice to move thoughtfully rather than chase recognition. The famous pianist heard about these gatherings through mutual contacts, and he observed from a distance, respecting her choices and reflecting on his own journey. And he began to speak more openly with students and colleagues about humility and listening. And he shared the story not to highlight her talent, but to examine his own assumptions, and these conversations influenced others more deeply than any formal lesson could have. Back in her daily life, the woman found that people interacted with her differently, though subtly, and some approached her with curiosity, while others simply treated her with a new attentiveness. And she accepted these changes calmly, understanding that perception evolves gradually, and she remained grounded by returning to the same routines that had always sustained her. She continued practicing quietly late in the evenings, allowing the music to unfold naturally without goals or deadlines. And these sessions became a space of reflection and renewal. And she explored new pieces not to prepare for performance, but to deepen her connection to sound and emotion. And this exploration reminded her that growth is ongoing and does not require an audience. There were moments of doubt when she wondered whether she should have pursued music more publicly earlier in life, and whether missed opportunities could return. And during these moments, she reminded herself that each season carries its own wisdom, and that her path had shaped her resilience, empathy, and clarity, and these qualities enriched her music in ways that could not be rushed. As time passed, the memory of the joke that began the moment lost its sharpness, and what remained was a shared understanding that had grown from it, and the woman felt grateful not because she had been validated, but because the experience affirmed her belief that truth, when expressed calmly, has the power to transform without force. This period became one of quiet integration, where the experience of being seen settled into her identity without overwhelming it, and she moved forward with patience, knowing that the most meaningful changes often occur beneath the surface, and that her relationship with music had deepened not because it was challenged, but because it was honored, and this understanding prepared her for the next phase of her journey with clarity, balance, and quiet confidence. Quiet confidence. As time continued to move forward, she entered a phase where the external attention had softened, and what remained was a deeper internal awareness of her purpose and direction. And this stage felt quieter yet more demanding, because it required her to listen closely to herself rather than respond to others. And she understood that growth at this level depends less on opportunity and more on discernment. She noticed that her relationship with music was changing again, not in intensity, but in depth, and she became more attentive to nuanced tone and restraint. And her practice sessions grew shorter yet more focused, because she listened carefully to what each piece required and what she needed emotionally in that moment. And this sensitivity allowed her playing to mature naturally without force. Balancing her personal life, work, and music continued to require intention, and there were days when fatigue tested her patience and made her question whether sustaining this balance was possible long-term. And during these moments, she reminded herself that rest is not withdrawal but preparation. And she allowed herself pauses without guilt, trusting that clarity often emerges through stillness. Some people around her expected her to pursue greater visibility and questioned her choice to move steadily rather than dramatically. And she listened without defensiveness, understanding that their perspectives were shaped by different values and experiences. And she chose not to justify her path, because she had learned that conviction does not require explanation. The famous pianist crossed her path again during a small cultural event, and their interaction was simple and respectful. And there was no mention of the past challenge or the moment that connected them, and this absence of reference felt meaningful, because it signaled mutual understanding and growth. And they spoke briefly about music as a shared language rather than a stage for comparison. She observed that his demeanor had softened, and that he listened more than he spoke, and she recognized this as evidence of his own transformation. And this recognition brought a quiet sense of closure because it affirmed that the moment they shared had left a lasting imprint beyond performance. During this period, she was invited to contribute to a local initiative focused on expanding access to music education. And she accepted thoughtfully because the cause aligned with her values and allowed her to give back without stepping into the spotlight. And she contributed time, insight, and guidance, helping shape programs that emphasized patients' encouragement and inclusion. Working with the initiative deepened her understanding of systemic barriers and reinforced her belief that talent exists everywhere even when opportunity does not. And this awareness strengthened her commitment to humility and service. And she found fulfillment in supporting structures that would allow others to discover their voices without waiting for permission. Mentoring became more intentional, and she guided a small group consistently sharing not only musical technique, but also lessons about resilience, balance, and self-respect. And she emphasized that progress is personal, and that comparison often distracts from growth, and her honesty resonated deeply because it reflected lived experience rather than theory. There were moments when she felt the weight of responsibility and worried about influencing others incorrectly, and she addressed this by remaining transparent about her own uncertainties and ongoing learning. And this openness created trust and reminded her that leadership does not require certainty but integrity. Her own creative exploration expanded as she began composing pieces inspired by everyday moments, conversations, and emotions. And this process felt liberating because it removed the need to interpret existing works and allowed her to speak in her own voice. And she embraced imperfection as part of authenticity, and this acceptance enriched her expression. At home, she continued nurturing relationships that grounded her, and these connections provided perspective and emotional support. And she valued these bonds deeply because they reminded her that identity is relational, and that belonging does not depend on achievement. As seasons changed, she reflected on how far she had come, not in terms of recognition, but in self-trust and alignment. And she recognized that the most significant shift had been internal, and that this shift allowed her to move through the world with steadiness and grace regardless of circumstance. This phase taught her that fulfillment is sustained by values rather than validation, and that choosing integrity repeatedly builds a foundation strong enough to support both success and uncertainty. And she carried this understanding forward, prepared to continue her journey with patience, clarity, and a deep sense of purpose, knowing that whatever came next would be met with honesty and quiet strength. As she moved into the next stage of her life, she began to sense a deeper clarity about who she was and what she was no longer willing to compromise, and this clarity did not arrive suddenly, but formed gradually through repeated choices, reflection, and experience. And she realized that the journey had shifted from discovery to direction, and this required a new level of responsibility and self-awareness. She became more intentional with her time, choosing fewer commitments and investing more fully in each one. And this focus allowed her to stay present and engaged rather than scattered. And she learned that saying no with honesty preserved energy and meaning, and allowed her to give more deeply where it mattered, and this discipline strengthened her sense of agency. Music continued to evolve for her, and she no longer approached it as something to prove or protect, but as something to live with, and she played often, but without urgency, listening closely to her inner state, and adjusting her expression accordingly. And this adaptability gave her playing a quiet depth that listeners felt even when they could not explain it. People who worked with her noticed her calm leadership, and the way she created space for others to grow without comparison or pressure. And she encouraged dialogue rather than instruction, and curiosity rather than certainty, and this approach fostered trust and collaboration, and reminded her that influence grows naturally when rooted in respect. The local music initiative expanded, and she took on a mentoring role that involved guiding facilitators and shaping values rather than directing outcomes. And this work challenged her to articulate principles she had lived quietly for years. And through this process, she gained greater understanding of her own journey and the choices that had shaped it. She spoke often about patience, consistency, and listening as foundations for growth. And she emphasized that talent requires care rather than urgency, and that environments of safety allow creativity to flourish. And these messages resonated with many because they offered an alternative to performance-driven narratives that often lead to burnout and doubt. At times, she felt the weight of being seen as an example, and she addressed this by remaining transparent about her limitations and ongoing learning. And this honesty reinforced the idea that leadership is not about perfection, but about presence and accountability, and this approach allowed her to remain grounded and authentic. Her relationship with the famous pianist remained distant yet respectful, and they occasionally exchanged brief conversations at events. And these interactions were marked by mutual understanding, rather than hierarchy, and the absence of tension or comparison reflected how far both had come since their first encounter. She noticed that her own sense of worth no longer fluctuated with external response, And this stability felt liberating, and she attributed it to years of aligning actions with values and choosing integrity over recognition. And this alignment allowed her to navigate both praise and criticism with balance and calm. Creative exploration remained central, and she continued composing quietly, drawing inspiration from ordinary experiences and emotions. And this work felt deeply personal and nourishing. And she shared some pieces selectively, not for approval but for connection. And when others responded, she listened with openness rather than attachment. Her personal relationships deepened as well, and she invested time in people who supported her growth and challenged her thoughtfully. And these connections provided perspective and reminded her that fulfillment is shared rather than achieved alone. And she valued these bonds as essential to her well-being. She reflected often on the earlier stages of her journey and felt gratitude rather than regret, because each phase had taught her something necessary. And she understood that resilience, humility, and patience were not obstacles to success, but foundations for a meaningful life. This stage of her life was marked by quiet confidence and steady purpose, and she no longer felt pulled by comparison or expectation, and instead moved forward guided by intention, curiosity, and care. And this grounding prepared her for whatever lay ahead, because she trusted her ability to listen, adapt, and remain true. As she continued walking her path, she carried with her the understanding that growth is ongoing, and that clarity is renewed through practice, reflection, and honest engagement with the world. And she embraced this process knowing that the journey itself was the reward, and that living with integrity was the most enduring form of success. The final stage of her journey arrived without announcement, and without ceremony, and it felt less like an ending and more like a quiet settling into who she had always been becoming. And she did not wake up one morning feeling transformed, yet over time she noticed that her decisions flowed more naturally, and her inner voice felt steady and trustworthy. And this steadiness became the foundation from which she lived, worked, and created. Music was no longer something separate from her life but woven into it seamlessly. And she played regularly, sometimes alone, sometimes with others, and sometimes in small community spaces where listening mattered more than performance. And each time she sat at the piano, she felt grounded because the instrument no longer represented challenge or proof, but companionship and expression. She continued contributing to music education initiatives with patience and care, and she watched as new programs took shape, offering access, encouragement, and safe spaces for learning. And she felt fulfillment not from recognition, but from seeing others discover confidence and curiosity. And she understood that impact often reveals itself slowly through consistency rather than visibility. Mentoring remained an important part of her life, and she guided others, gently sharing not only knowledge but perspective. And she emphasized that growth is not linear, and that doubt does not signal failure but invites reflection. And many found comfort in her calm honesty, because it reflected real experience rather than idealized success. Her own creative work matured further, and she composed pieces that reflected simplicity, depth, and restraint. And these works carried traces of her journey: patience, humility, resilience, and quiet strength. And when she shared them, she did so selectively, choosing moments that felt aligned rather than strategic. And this approach preserved the sincerity of her expression. The famous pianist remained part of her broader musical world, though not centrally. And when their paths crossed, there was mutual respect and ease, and no reference to the past. Challenge was needed because its lesson had already been absorbed and transformed. And their shared understanding reflected growth on both sides. She noticed that people now engaged with her without assumptions or curiosity driven by surprise, and this shift felt affirming, because it signaled that she was seen as a whole person rather than a moment or story. And this allowed her to move freely without carrying expectations that once felt heavy. At home and among close relationships, she felt deeply supported, and these connections grounded her, reminding her that identity is sustained through belonging and care. And she valued these bonds as essential anchors that kept her perspective balanced and humane. As time passed, she reflected on the night when everything began, and she no longer felt any trace of discomfort or defensiveness. And instead she felt gratitude, because that moment had revealed her voice not by force, but by invitation. And she understood that courage often appears quietly when one chooses authenticity over avoidance. She recognized that her journey had never been about proving someone wrong or surprising an audience, but about honoring a relationship with music that had carried her through different seasons of life. And this realization brought peace because it freed her from narratives of conflict and allowed her to embrace continuity. The community around her continued to evolve in small, meaningful ways, and more people began valuing access, patience, and empathy. And while she did not claim responsibility, she acknowledged the power of lived example and remained mindful of how her choices could influence others simply by being consistent and honest. Looking ahead, she saw a future that was open, flexible, and grounded, and this openness felt reassuring rather than uncertain, because she trusted her ability to listen, adapt, and choose with integrity. and she no longer felt pressured to define where she was going because she was confident in how she would move. Her life settled into a rhythm shaped by intention, balance, and care, and she measured success not by milestones, but by alignment and peace. And this measure allowed her to navigate change without losing herself and to welcome growth without urgency. The woman who had once been challenged as a joke now lived without needing to respond to challenges at all, and she carried herself with quiet assurance rooted in self-respect and purpose. And her story became a reminder that true astonishment does not come from shock or spectacle, but from witnessing someone live fully and honestly in alignment with who they are. And so the journey continued not as a conclusion, but as a steady unfolding guided by patience, truth, and presence. And she moved forward knowing that her voice had always mattered, and that listening to it had been the most important choice of all.